Well, good day, y'all. And it's good to see you all here on this beautiful day. And that was a lovely rendition of Rebecca's official biography. But I just want to share 3 things you may not know about Rebecca that don't make it into the very impressive and kind of daunting list of accomplishments that she has. The first is that she was a cheerleader in high school. And this was because the school had compulsory sport, and she has a morbid fear of round projectiles.
It's true.
She is accused of selling out to Cheetos. And
we might explain that later.
we will circle back, I hope, to all of these intriguing facts. But the third is that she knows how to say, "The garden has high fences around it," in Hungarian, which is way more difficult than I would ever have imagined. So we're going to get back to all these things. But before we start, I want to say that I have to be the 10,000th interviewer to say, I have some questions for you.
I knew when we settled on that title. I was like, you brace yourself for every interview, but I
just had to spit that out. But before we get to the new novel, I would like to, if it's okay with you, just explore your journey to writing, starting with your rich linguistic childhood.
That's my parents were both linguistics professors, grew up going to a lot of linguistics conferences in various university towns. I was, you say rich linguistics childhood. I was not raised bilingual, which they very easily could have done. So it's not quite as rich in that way as you might think, but certainly was surrounded by fascinating people.
Did your parents meet in Hungary or after they came?
Only my father is Hungarian, actually.
Oh, okay.
My mother's American, and they met in graduate school for linguistics. It's an interesting, I think, correlation. They were both linguists. They're both also very talented, just amateur musicians, which I think there's a lot in common there. My sister is a professional piano teacher. I'm a writer, and I think there's all of that, the sound of language. Certainly storytelling is a different category, but there's something with language and music and the ear for foreign languages that all goes together in a nice way.
And your grandmother was a novelist.
Right. My father's mother in Hungary was a novelist, yeah.
And there are 14 novels?
Oh, 40. 40.
40?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, she was incredibly prolific.
Were they any good?
I don't hear... Okay, apparently... I don't know, because my Hungarian is not good enough to read them. Yeah. And I've read a few things, shorter things by her in translation. This is one reason I'm, constantly working on my Hungarian, and this is one reason I feel like this would be. She died when I was a baby, relatively young, and this is the person in my family that, in some ways, I have the most in common with, and I have 40 books sitting there on my shelf. And they're in what happens to be the most difficult language in the world to learn, as if it's not your native language. But it's a lifelong challenge. And I think, if I'll get there, I'll write a memoir about the whole experience. I'll eventually read them. But she was really highly regarded. She's, maybe not in fashion right now, but people definitely, remember her name, knew who she was.
And were the books published in Hungary, or did they have to be smuggled out?
So most of them were published in Hungary, in Hungarian, although she had a lot of censorship on her. 2 manuscripts, at least, she realized she couldn't publish during her lifetime. And so smuggled them out. One of them was, but my mother, who is American, traveled alone into communist Hungary in 1960, maybe, to meet alone her very intimidating future mother-in-law, who then gave her a manuscript to smuggle out of the country on the train. People wore girdles, and so she had these kind of very thin onion skin papers, and she strapped them around herself in this girdle, and got them, and then that book was finally published in the late 90s in Hungarian, which is where there would be interest, but after the communist government was gone. But hell of a way to meet your future mother-in-law.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And just, can we just circle back to that sentence that you were trying to master? You told me yesterday.
Oh, good God.
Yeah,
the problem is if I can remember the word for fence. But yeah, so here's the thing. I'll say it. I'm gonna muddle the word for fence, but it would be a körül, a kert körül, egy magas. No, I said három magas keres something.
It doesn't matter about the Hungarian.
Yeah, but I'll tell you in English, which is the interesting part. It's like and I said it wrong. Okay. If anyone speaks, there are no Hungarian speakers in the audience, are there? Okay, I said something wrong. But yeah, what I was explaining was, it's like if you said there's a fence around the garden, you could just say there's basically say that. But if you're saying there's a fence around this garden, now I have to say around the garden around 3 tall fence stands. Because and now I said a number, so now everything's singular again. But also, and then one word changes, because when you say the rules are so arcane and they're beautiful. But this is a language that developed just completely in isolation. But I'm fascinated. I'm obsessed with it. I'm obsessed with learning it, and it's just so hard. Yeah.
And you have a few other things on.
a few other things going on. It is, it's Duolingo on my phone. Is a lot of it. Love the Duolingo. The great thing about Duolingo Hungarian is they haven't really developed the course, so they don't explain any of it. There's no tips. There's no it's just like, hey, figure this out.
So to circle back to this novel, I want to go indirectly at it. Actually, no. Before we've only done your childhood. I was really fascinated by something you said. You taught in Montessori school.
I did. Yeah,
for a long time. Huh?
12 years. Yeah, 12 years. Elementary Montessori.
And I was fascinated by what you said about what you learned from reading to those kids.
Oh yeah. I say this a lot. This was an incredible literary training and training in storytelling, which was just that half an hour at the end of every school day for 12 years was read aloud time. I'm reading Charlotte's Web or The Weston Game or whatever it is. It was an incredible education in when people might get bored or lost. Because you're reading, I think it could be very, you're a writer, you're sitting alone in your office and you're imagining that everyone's going to be hanging on your every word, and isn't that great? The reality that you're faced with, if you are reading to children, is they start squirming around. Someone's, gets the craft scissors and now they're cutting their hair, and they're you have instant visual feedback on what works, and also where are they confused, where are they, where did we lose them? It's something that I think I am a person, because I have ADHD. I'm someone with who thinks a lot about attention myself. I think I would already be very interested and keep kind of tuned in to what might get boring, where I might lose someone. But I cannot imagine a better training than this. Just it's not my words, so there's no offense taken when they're rolling around and glazed over. But just you learn what are those moments and what could get someone hooked back in.
I loved reading to my sons because it gave children's literature and YA. There's a great appreciation of plot. Mm-hmm. And I'm a big fan of plot.
Mm-hmm. Yes, me too.
And in kids' literature, X is really interesting. Mm-hmm. And then Y happens, and X plus Y are exponentially more interesting. And the story goes on from there. And I get the sense that you're a person who appreciates plot.
Very much. Yeah, and it's, I think there's great literary merit to plenty of books that are less plot-driven or have much less traditional plot structures. But my personal taste is I want to tell a story. I want to read a story. I want to have that propulsion if I need to turn one more page. And that can be a very serious book at the same time. You can get at some really, the medicine in that spoonful of sugar can be there. but I really need both, because I will say my personal taste is also that I have a hard time reading something that was really just written with entertainment value in mind. I think it's great that it exists. That's not my taste. I want the page turner that is also making me really think, or troubling me, or I find, I've never read something quite like this before. So yeah, that's always, I don't think I'll ever be tempted to write something that does not have a strong plot, because I would not be interested in that.
Well, all your novels have got incredibly propulsive
Thank you.
plot. And I loved this line from, it was a review of your first book, The Borrower. It strikes a nice balance between literary artistry and gripping storytelling.
Oh, that's nice.
And I think that characterizes all your books. And I think that, so the literary artistry part of it, so after you, what made you stop teaching? What was the...
just success as my books were getting published.
Right.
So I was writing all along. I was writing, by about 8th or 9th grade, I wanted to be a writer. I was writing constantly, was publishing short stories as I was teaching, finished my first novel. And I actually taught still part-time the year after my first novel came out. But that's a job, you are in the classroom 7 hours straight every day. That's not the kind of thing where you can take off to do a literary festival, or and by that point I had 2 small children also. So it's a job that I had energy for when I was young.
Yeah.
And God bless anyone who can keep up with young children in a classroom after the age of about 32.
Well, yeah, absolutely. These heroic and incredibly skillful people who do that work. But what I've found with teaching, even with even teaching young adults, is it's so, you have to put so much energy into it.
Yeah.
So, to have any energy left over to write, I take my hat off. But when did you do Breadloaf?
The Breadloaf, that's the graduate program at Breadloaf, which some people know for its writers' conference, which was also amazing. That was summers. It's a summer program in English literature. And so that fit, I would teach elementary school during the year, do graduate school in the summer, repeat, and somewhere in there was also writing.
Right.
And
I have to say, I first came across your work when I was editing Best American Short Stories in 2011. And I had the honor of being the 4th guest editor for that series to choose one of your stories.
Yes, thank you.
And that was 4 in a row, Best American Short Stories. And there's only one person, I think, who can top that. And that was Irving Shaw.
I believe that's right. So it's tricky because you have to start counting from when there was a guest editor. Back in the day when it was one editor, they'd choose their friends every time.
Well, we forget that. Yeah.
But yeah, I think there may be 2 or 3 in that era sense. But it was, that was something that really made my career. You're writing short stories, you're sending them out, and you're publishing them in, what to a writer is an amazing, like, oh my God, the Iowa Review. But to the general reader, they're not picking that up. That's not the big time necessarily. And then stories, the Best American Short Stories is one of those anthologies where they sweep through all of those literary journals and select certain ones. And that, even just the first time that happened, that was the biggest thing that had, happened in my career by far.
Although you did have stunningly early success as a short story writer. What, your 3rd submission, was it?
Yeah. And certainly, there were several factors that went into that. One was just doing, kind of knowing the literary landscape and having worked at a literary journal and knowing how much I had to revise. I think that, I have a lot of very, very talented students who, certainly a lot of it is just luck, whether something finds the right home. And also, have you researched what editor is looking for what kind of thing, what's someone's taste? But also, sometimes that last step is just, do you understand how many times you have to revise this thing? You have to reject it yourself many, many times before you can send it out and let someone else reject it. So, I was very, very, very lucky, and I think also just was fortunate to be aware of how much self-rejection had to go on before the work went out into the world.
I'm always in awe of short story writers because in a novel you can afford a few flaccid pages.
Yeah.
But in a short story, you can't afford a paragraph that isn't propulsive. And so,
think of it like painting a picture on the head of a pin or something, just absolutely impossible.
How do you feel about the two different forms? Do you have a favorite?
No, I don't. I think that I'm very, I am driven by the story that I want to tell. That's, I find, there are always competing stories that I want to tell. One of them kind of becomes more urgent. And some of those are short story-sized ideas. They're not things I would want to sustain for 300 pages. They're not something you want to read for 300 pages. Maybe it's more experimental. Maybe it's just not a world that I want to live in for that long. And other things are just bigger, deeper topics. I couldn't do that in 9,000 words. I need that 300-page book. But I love both forms, and I'm always on the soapbox of you should, if you're a serious reader, you should be reading short stories because they're the edges of experimentation of what any author is able to do are there, and you're going to discover you pick up one of those anthologies, you're going to discover so many new writers.
Yeah, that's true. So talking about situations, and you're always intrigued by a number of them. How did the situation at the heart of I Have Some Questions come to you?
Right. So I should do two things. I should kind of explain what that situation is, and then I should tell you. So the basic story is that we have a woman who's she's 40, she's a film historian, and she is invited back for 2 weeks to teach a mini course at the boarding school that she herself attended in the 90s in New Hampshire as an Adrift scholarship kid. And while she's back there, her mind is, of course, on her own past, but very soon, very quickly, on the death her senior year of a young woman in her class. They weren't friends, but this affected her a lot, and this young woman was found dead in the campus swimming pool with significant injuries to her body. And very quickly, a young black man who worked as an athletic trainer at the school was arrested with what seemed like a mountain of evidence against him, including a confession. He's been in prison. A lot of people believe he's innocent, including one of her students who wants to then do a project about this. And she's drawn back into thinking about it, and the book goes from there. There are several origin points. You think of it, kind of tributaries into the one river. One is I do live on the campus of the boarding school where my husband teaches. Some of you might have heard me say this yesterday on a panel, but the short version of the complicated story is I was a day student at a boarding school near Chicago. I left, I graduated, I came out east, I met this guy. He was a high school English teacher. I dragged him back to Chicago. The place he got the job was my old high school. It was supposed to be for 3 years. It's been 22 years. And so I've lived for 22 years on the campus of my boarding school, although I don't teach there. So it was inevitable that at some point I was going to write a boarding school novel. People would ask me, and it's a fascinating setting. I think it's fascinating for people to read about if they didn't go to a school like that. And it's fascinating to read about if you did go to a school like that. And it's also a setting that I think people tend to get wrong and misrepresent in a lot of ways. There's a little bit of I don't want to tell the real version here. That was going on. I was working on this in the early days of Me Too, which is in many ways, was so much about looking back for so many of us, looking back on high school, looking back on college with a different lens. That came together with it. That idea of looking back, I didn't want to write a YA novel. Decided, I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna write an actual mystery. Mysteries are essentially about looking back. What already happened here? How can we interpret what already happened here? And so that all came together.
And you have a very powerful protagonist. Can you tell us about Bodhi and how she came to you?
Yeah. She's right. She's someone. It's interesting. I needed someone. I sort of, I'm a writer who's there. There are a lot of writers who start with character, and the character kind of has a voice and speaks to them, and then their job as a writer is how do I push this character into trouble. the way that it comes naturally to me is to think first about conflict, the situation, and then to go, okay, who is going to get themselves into this kind of mess? And kind of reverse engineer the character who's going to be the most affected by this, the most changed by it, get in the deepest. So I needed someone who was going to be very put together and capable as an adult, but had been quite adrift as a teenager, so that when she steps back on that campus, she's pulled between those two people. So I have, she's someone who is, she's quite well known as a film historian. She has the successful podcast. She's also kind of in the midst of a divorce. Things are a little wobblier for her.
And her husband is an artist. Visual artist?
Yeah, her husband gets Me Too'd while she's there. So things, I'm kind of pulling away all of her foundations as I put her back on this campus. Your job as a writer is often to torture your character, not out of some sadistic, inclination, but you want the character by the end of the story or by the midpoint of the story to be capable of things that they weren't capable of at the beginning, whether those are good or bad. And not 100% of the time, but it's something I always have an eye on. How can I destabilize this person or spur this person into action? So I needed someone kind of simultaneously incredibly capable, but there's a little bit of quicksand still at her foundation.
So she's the I in the title. I have some questions for you. The you does not. It's not evident immediately,
right?
But tell us about the you.
Yeah, and I don't feel like this is too much of a spoiler because I think within a few pages you learn. But right, there is a you, and it's it's a first person book. It's not constant you. It's not like a choose your own adventure you kind of book. But there's someone the book is being sort of addressed to, and the very minor spoiler is that this is a man who had been a music teacher at the school. And one of those people who was just very, very close to the students, who all loved him, but in retrospect, maybe that was creepy. And the rumor at the time had been that he and Thalia Keith, this is the young woman who winds up dead, that they had been involved in some way. And in the intervening years, Bodhi has felt like, well, that was clearly just adolescent rumor, but returns and really starts thinking about it again and going, he should have been investigated, and he wasn't. And so the book is addressed to him, kind of thought at him, in the same way that when you return to a place where and there's someone who's on your mind, you do kind of think at them, right? So that it allowed me to make some fun narrative choices.
There's a wonderful line. I'm going to butcher it, I think, but and I don't think it's a spoiler. But when she says to him in her mind, I was incorrect, but I wasn't wrong.
Yeah.
And I thought about that because as a journalist, I often thought how something can be accurate but not true.
Right. Yeah.
And I always sort of, a very trivial example of that was when my boss was trying to convince us to take a job in Cairo. She said, it comes with an apartment with 3 bathrooms and a view of the pyramids. That was accurate, but it wasn't true because none of the bathrooms had working toilets. And the view of the pyramids I saw precisely once when there was no dust in the air in Cairo.
Oh, my God. Yeah. Totally. But it's that question of that it is, it is really interesting in a narrative to examine truth and memory because, all that you know about yourself is memory, right? You're sitting here, everything else you know about yourself is a memory. And then, of course those aren't accurate. Of course they're skewed, of course they're subjective. And the stories we tell ourselves, I love thinking about that connection. My work as a storyteller, your work as a storyteller, and how we can draw all the questions we tell ourselves into that microscope.
Yeah. And this, I think at heart, probably the biggest theme that came through to me in this book is about violence against women in all its forms, and you really have such a nuanced take on that. But you also have an incredibly brave and nuanced take on the Me Too movement. And so there was a kind of a feverish, I would characterize it as perhaps an overcorrection.
Right.
And you get at the heart of this really beautifully when Bodhi's estranged, not entirely estranged, but the husband that she's breaking up with is Me Too'd over a transgression that. Do you want to just?
Yeah, I can explain. I mean, just as background, I think we've all had those moments within that Me Too reckoning of seeing, a case or two where we go, oh, well, not that. That's not that's not the same. Whatever that was for you, and that line is in different places for different people. But as we figure out what this all is, as the pendulum swings, are there moments where you go, oh, that's a little too far? This is, of course, this is a completely fictional one, and it's one that I chose because I don't think literally every reader would have the same reaction to it. But it's that her husband, before he was married to her, had a relationship with a woman, I think I said 15 years younger, but she was an adult.
She was 21.
She was 21, right. She worked for a gallery. He was an up-and-coming artist, and she is now making an art piece about him and saying this was, clearly, it's not even what she's saying, it's what other people are saying in response, that this was a predatory relationship because of the age gap between them and because he had more power as an artist. My character comes down on, oh, come on, don't be ridiculous. This is not the same.
Before you go any further, could I get you to read this bit? It's a little bit hard to read, but it's really worth it, I think, because you get at the heart of what goes on in a Twitter storm more beautifully. And so the scene, just to set it up, is Bodhi's had a few drinks, and she makes a mistake of reading what's being said about her ex.
Yeah.
And she just, so first the Twitter storm, and then she does that thing that all of us have regretted doing after a few drinks, is responds.
So, I'm not saying she makes good decisions here.
Just start wherever you want.
Okay, sure, yeah. So she's reading this thread, and her husband's name is Jerome Wager. So these are kind of tweets.
And she's a feminist, her podcast is a feminist podcast.
Right. So the tweets, let's not forget that Jerome Wager's work is terrible plus derivative. He's just one of the many scum men who run the planet. Someone then tagging the artist, what Wild Jazz has done is ferocious and brave. If you've been harmed by Jerome Wager, DM me, I will protect your anonymity. Can someone explain to me how Jerome Wager still has a platform? He's still on Twitter, and CGR Gallery has made no statement denouncing his actions. This doesn't seem like abuse to me. It seems like a shitty relationship. Are we canceling people now for being bad at dating? It's sad this has to be, sorry, I'm skipping a couple of those. Oh no, it's sad this has to be explained to you. Lording power over someone, even soft power, is structural imbalance. Abuse does not have to equal rape. Still no statement from Ms. Bodhi Kane, and that's her, hello, at Starlit Pod, her podcast. Even if Jerome Wager faces repercussion, the damage is done. How many gallery shows should have gone to other people? How much money has he made wielding his power and keeping others down? We have one law in this country about the age of consent, and it's the age of 18. Someone 18 can screw someone 100, and I'm sorry, but it's perfectly legal. Actually, some places it's younger, but this is not about the age of consent, you absolute dingbat. And then, I don't know if you, that's the storm. You want me to keep?
I'd like you to.
Yeah, I'll go. Okay, so I'll skip ahead. She's basically saying, kind of feeling like, drunken anger that, what he did is not as bad as what she's looking back right now on high school and thinking about actual abuse. So I typed out a thread of messages with my pruning thumb. She's in the bathtub, posting each after a quick scan for drunken typos. Has Jasmine Wilde even asked for repercussions? This is a work of art, not, as far as I know, a call to action. I'm no longer with Jerome Wager, but as a survival of actual sexual assault, this all sits wrong with me. Age is not the only form of power. You could argue that working for the gallery, Jasmine had as much power over him as he had over her. Are we talking about the feminism of empowerment or the feminism of victimhood? Either a 21-year-old woman is an adult who can make her own decisions or a helpless waif who needs our protection against big, scary men. Which is it? It can't be both. Are we saying a 21-year-old woman lacks sexual agency, lacks the ability to make decisions about her own body? Whose permission does she need to date someone older? Her father's? This is infantilizing. What age range would be acceptable to all of you? Is 5 years older okay? Is 1 year older okay? 1 month? That said, Jasmine has created an evocative piece of art. Let's leave it at that. Art, not a call for the Twitter mob. I stopped myself because my blood pressure was only going up and I hadn't run any of this by Jerome and there were already replies coming in that I didn't want to read. I managed not to slip on the floor, managed to make it to the bed. Things do not go well after that.
I just want to raise one more important theme in this book before we open it up to questions. I've hogged way too much of the time, but this book is really powerful on the absolute brutalities of the carceral system and its structural racism.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very important theme in the book, and you handle it brilliantly. And you also wrote, before the book came out, I think, the best essay I have read on the fraught business of writing the other.
Yeah, I actually published that before The Great Believers came out, my previous book.
That's right.
Which is about the AIDS epidemic in Chicago. So it was very much about, the ethics and considerations involved in representing someone else, especially someone with less structural power. It's less of, The Great Believers was very much about, the AIDS epidemic. This book is about the carceral system, but it's not the main topic of the book. As the book goes on, she becomes more and more aware of the plight of this man who's been convicted, and it becomes, within the second half of the book, becomes centralized. There was, I think I stand by that same essay in terms of, and some of you were at a panel I was on yesterday where we talked about this, but the legwork involved in doing your research and thinking deeply about why am I doing this to begin with, and then interviews, research, etc. I did speak to people who'd been incarcerated. That was one thing. I also, it would be so easy to kind of just fudge the legal system, and any TV show you watch does that. They make it much more dramatic, and I just was not interested in doing that. So I spent a lot of time with this wonderful public defender from New Hampshire, just the intricacies of specifically New Hampshire appellate law, which I knew nothing about. I still know nothing about other than what's in the book. But making sure, am I really doing the work to represent this, rather than grabbing this for my own uses as a plot device.
Okay, so I think, does anybody have questions for Rebecca? Yes. Could you come to the microphone? That would be great.
It was a joke. First of all, congratulations. You're obviously a joy to read, and
thank you.
Many people here, I'm sure, have followed your career. I am new to your work, so I just finished your book that's up there. But I would love to get your thoughts on what advice you would give to people who are looking to become writers of fiction, especially those that are on the precipice of publishing their first book.
Ooh.
Self-publishing, I might add, which is probably a whole different space than you're in, I understand, but still would love to get your advice.
Yeah. This is, so much of what I do, I love teaching. And so I still love teaching writing, and I love, working with writers who are developing and getting to that place of the first book or the first story. God, that's a very broad question, of course. I would say in terms of people who are, just approaching fiction writing, who are interested in it, there are so many resources out there for learning that are outside of academia. I think there's, people can worry that they need to enroll in an MFA program, and there are so many incredible places that she read in my bio, I run a place called Story Studio Chicago. That's a nonprofit writing arts center. For New Englanders, there's Grub Street in Boston. A lot of these places, including, I think all of them, have gone online because of, COVID, and then have stayed there partly. So there's so many resources for really, serious study of a serious craft. And then, the publication thing, I would say the one of many things I tell you is the best thing you can do to protect your mental health is start your next book now. So that no matter what someone says about the previous book, you'll be like, oh yeah, that was my last book. Next one's gonna be great.
Jace?
Yeah.
I was wondering, so I play quite a few instruments and I know bits and pieces of a few languages, and I know this was like all the way at the beginning, but I wanted to ask, like, how do you think, more on how do you think that music and writing, storytelling are connected?
Yeah.
And additionally, how do you think that music has affected your writing style?
That's a great question. My story collection is actually called Music for Wartime, and it's a lot of the stories in there are about music, musicians, kind of the confluence of art and how do we make art in the middle of a pretty brutal world. So I would say, I think most specifically, music, as it's a matter of the ear, is relating to just, the sounds on the page. Can I write a sentence, not just that it's not about sounding pretty, but can I write a sentence that do I hear the rhythm of my own sentence? Can I find the tension of my own sentence, the momentum of my own sentence? I will, especially at the end of something where I think sound matters the most, I will literally be banging out the rhythm on a table. And this is prose, this isn't poetry. But that matters to me hugely, and I think it's something that people can learn, just as they can learn to have a better ear in music. But when someone has that naturally, that's awesome. I also think that when you think about if you've studied music seriously or you play music seriously, you think about those lines of tension and release throughout a piece. Where am I building up? Where's a moment of respite? How long can I sustain tension? Very similar to, how do you hold the attention of a child? How do I hold someone's attention musically? How do I keep this momentum through a piece? It's not something that I'm not sitting there thinking actively about music when I write. But I do think that a training in music is helpful that way. I would imagine that people who have backgrounds in other things would, I would imagine that someone could say, their background in basketball helped them enormously as a writer, or whatever, or swimming, or whatever it is. But it's you take the things that and you find the ways that they're relevant to the thing you're making.
I think that's the best thing about being a novelist, actually, because anything you've done is prep.
Yeah.
You don't have to have mastered the periodic table, or, you don't have to have dexterity with tools. Whatever you've done.
Yeah. And I can tell you from various karaoke nights at various writers' conferences, I know a lot of seriously tone-deaf writers.
Oh, my.
Who are nevertheless brilliant writers.
Right. We never circled back to the Cheetos accusation.
The Cheetos, oh my God, this is so funny. Yes. So I was writing about this. I have a Substack.
It's a wonderful Substack. Max Stack. You have to check it out.
Submax. So SUBMAKK.
Sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. But I was writing. I just thought this was very funny. I got this irate email from a reader that said, and it took me so long to figure out what she was saying. She said, I can't, how dare you sell out to Cheetos? A writer of your, caliber, whatever, is nothing sacred anymore. And I went, what is she talking about? And I finally realized there's one scene in my novel where a character eats Cheetos. And I think I put it together. She thought that was like a corporate sponsorship, that I had put Cheetos in my novel.
If only it was that easy.
Oh my God, we'd be making so much money. Just like, and he drove a Jeep and they wear a Rolex. But she's thinking, I think, certainly, like, yeah, if it were a reality, if it's The Bachelor and someone's eating Cheetos, yeah, they probably paid for that. But good God, they're not coming. Can you imagine the Frito-Lay meeting where they're like, let's ask this literary novelist to put Cheetos in one scene of this novel? So that cracked me up. I wish it were that. I would take Cheetos money. Why not? I would get in bed with Frito-Lay.
If there are any more questions, this is your chance. One more.
One there?
Yeah. Two more. Okay. And that'll probably be.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah.
I just want to say that I lived for 24 years in boarding schools, and I was also the dean of students in one. So I do want to congratulate you because I feel that it was very convincing, your sense of what that life is like. But it also seemed to me that it's almost a character. The boarding school is almost a character in this novel. There's that closed system. Do you think it? Talk about, you live on a boarding school campus. Both my children are boarding school teachers, so I'm sure I emphasize that life in my reading of your novel more perhaps than you meant it to be. But it feels unhealthy in a way, a very closed system. You could live on a submarine or a monastery and have that same sort of closed system. But talk about how that influenced characters and how you see that mystery and everything in boarding school.
Yeah, I'll say that one aspect of that I can answer easily is it was really interesting to me to have these memories of 1995, but also she's there in 2018. And the differences, I gave her my high school graduation year just to make things culturally easier. 1995, I graduated. I got my first email account on my first day of college in the fall of 95. So this was kind of, high school was pre-internet, college was internet. And this is, the boarding school that I'm depicting is particularly remote. There's really nothing else there. So there would be this isolation. And then there's also just, some of the cultural things of the 90s that we thought we were so progressive in the 90s, and then you look back and go, oh my God. But the rape culture on campuses in the 90s, the sexism, the racism on campus in the 90s. And I'm not portraying the 2018 campus as perfect, but it was very fun and interesting for me to juxtapose those two and to write in 2018 about students who were almost painfully self-aware, right? They overthink everything, but have a very different connection to the world and a lot more resources. And it's less claustrophobic.
And they're so idealistic, and they're gonna save us.
Right.
We have one more, and then I think we're gonna get it wrapped.
This might be quick. How do you come up with the names of your characters? They were not typical names.
That's why I actually just wrote a Substack post about naming characters. I love naming characters. I really don't feel like I have a handle on my character until I know the name. And when I find the right name, then it's like, oh, that's it. I know this person. I think, they need to be slightly memorable. They need to be, just a little bit different. You're not going to put a Dan and a Dave and a Doug in the same book. Things like, those are all great names, but not for the same book. And I think names have power. I think I don't imagine that many of us in this tent are necessarily from a culture that literally believes in spiritual power of names, but there absolutely are cultures that do. And I think that there's some truth there. They're really, if nothing else, they're just such deep linguistic connotations to a name that carries its own power.
Well, give it up for the name Rebecca Makkai.
Aw, thank you.
Thank you so much to both Rebecca and Geraldine for this wonderful session. Rebecca will be available to sign.